Good afternoon, everybody. I am Wilhelm van Rensburg. I am Senior Art Specialist at the Fine Art Auctioneer Strauss Company. Now, Strauss Company has been involved in the Turbine Art Fair for many, many years. The past three or four years, I was involved in, now the slides don't want to change. Is this, or must I do here? There we go. Yeah, okay. I was involved in mounting exhibitions the past 4 years, and we like to offer a museum quality exhibition. So in 2017, I looked at the landscapes of Pyrenees, and I drew extensively on the collection of one very passionate collector. And I wanted to dovetail with one of the aims of the fair, and that is to engender the habit of collecting art, because this particular collector started at the age of 12 when he bought his very first Pyrenees lino cut for a couple of hundred of rands. And today he is not shy to pay a good 10 million for one of Pyrenees' large-scale landscapes. In 2018, I moved on to the still lifes of Emma Stern, and I mounted that exhibition of some lovely examples of her work. Last year, 2019, the overall theme of the Turbine Art Fair was the Year of the Mirror, and I chose two artists whose work I thought mirrored each other quite well. Louis Makubela and Douglas Portway. Very interesting work because they were both very abstract. At some point in the mid-1960s, these two artists actually met. Douglas Portway was already living in the UK, and Louis Makubela was on the eve of immigrating to the UK himself. This year, because the overall theme of the RMB Turbine Art Fair is visionary art, I thought of two artists in my mind, two visionary artists, and in this case, Maggie Laubser and Gladys Mgudlandlu, because I think in their own right, both of these artists were visionary in their art, but their lives run in parallel with each other. They never met, as far as I know. When you look at their lives, you will see that there are many similarities. Both these two artists grew up in a rural environment. Gladys Mgudlandlu from the Fingo people, and she was born in Pedi in the Eastern Cape. Maggie Laubser, born in the Malmesbury district in the Western Cape. Both enjoyed a very religious upbringing. Gladys Mgudlandlu was from missionary stock, and her parents belonged to the African Methodist congregation, but she was also fully aware of the Xhosa seer and mystic Nsikana in the area where she grew up. Maggie Laubser, on the other hand, a Calvinist upbringing, but she soon discovered Christian Science. Christian Science, as you well know, emphasizes the metaphysical over the physical or the reality. It has a more philosophical idealism to its beliefs, and it sort of looked at the primacy of the mind over matter, the mind over the physical body, so to speak. And also, interestingly enough, both their families and their wider communities were vehemently opposed to their artistic inclination. I think when you look at their training, also very different. Gladys mainly self-taught, but when she moved to the Cape in the early 1950s, she met up with other artists who mentored her, the likes of Marjorie Wallace, Gregoire Bunzaya, and Catherine Harris. Maggie Laubser, on the other hand, a more conventional art education. First of all, when she moved to Cape Town from the Malmesbury district, she was mentored by Edward Roworth, a more academic, more classic, more conventional teacher. But soon after that, in 1913, she went to Europe, and she went to the Netherlands, to England and Scotland. In England, she studied at the Slade School of Art, then on to Belgium, Italy, where she worked around Lake Garda, with Arnold Balwe, and then on to Germany, where in 1922 she met Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, probably one of the foremost exponents of German expressionists, and he, of course, influenced her tremendously. I think when you look at the criticism, how their art was perceived after their first exhibitions, very similar. Maggie Laubser's art was described as shocking, as distorted, as childish. And I'm showing you on the screen a review done by Bessie Head, the writer Bessie Head, in 1963, where again she calls Gladys Mgudlandlu's work childish cribbles. She says it was too naive, too innocent, because Gladys was completely out of tune with the political realities of the time. For me, what is most striking is the similarity in subject matter between these two artists. They were both very fond of depicting birds. This is an interesting example. She calls this particular one, There Is No Life Without Religion. And I think that is evident in the collar of the bird. She, of course, referenced the birds of the Eastern Cape that she was, where she grew up, and with which she was very familiar. Now it's interesting when you put her birds side by side with some of the birds by Maggie Laubser, you get interesting similarities like that. Birds in flight within Gladys's painting on the right, and more stationary water birds that Maggie depicted on the left-hand side. But look at the level of abstraction there. Look at the interesting rhythm between what you see, what is so striking between these two examples. Here you have examples of the flamingos, the more water birds that Maggie is famous for. And I want you to take note of the work on the left because of the rainbow, because later on I will return to the aspect of these two artists as visionary artists, and that is where the rainbow then becomes quite significant. I think my favorite example on the whole exhibition is this goose among arum lilies. Arum lilies, my favorite flower. Again, this is a famous example in the Johannesburg Art Gallery. I think the motherly nurturing aspect, I think, is quite evident here. Apart from the birds, both artists also explored the landscape, as you can see in these two lovely examples here. On the left, Gladys Mgudlandlu, on the right, Maggie Laubser. But I'd like you to look at the vision here, the tall trees in the foreground of the Gladys landscape that you would expect further back, maybe in the middle or the background, and she places it right in front. And that gives for a very interesting middle ground, very mysterious middle ground. But again, look at the rhythm in those tall trees, and the rhythm, I think I certainly found also in evidence in the Maggie Laubser work on the right-hand side with those haystacks in a row juxtaposed against the sea, and those boats and maybe the sails of the boats echoing the shape of the haystacks in the middle ground. Look at the use of color in these two landscapes as well, the greens and the blues. And again, Gladys, very interesting, placing the cattle, sort of almost obscuring them in the middle ground. And again, that sort of dominant treetops in the front. Perhaps a strange example of the use of color in terms of Maggie Laubser's work on the left. But I think here, this is the color she encountered in the art in England and in Scotland when she was there in the 1910s. Two lovely examples, the striking pink trees in the foreground of the Maggie landscape, and also the placement of the huts, the traditional huts, I find very interesting that is so similar in these two particular examples. This for me is indicative of Maggie's interest in Christian Science, because here she, I think, glorifies the power of the sun, the glorious nature of everything bathed in full sunlight. She rarely painted shadows in her work, and the lovely color, I think, is also indicative of the very bright primary colors that she encountered when she studied under Carl Schmidt-Rottluff in Germany. But I'm showing you this because it's interesting. The pairs of figures carrying baskets and the like on their heads, and bundles of wood that you also see in this lovely example. This is from the in art collection, and examples such as this, foregrounding the figure, making the figure, I think, more important than the more recessive rendering of the figure in a typical Maggie landscape. Another example of landscapes here, you also have Maggie depicting birds in full flight. Another rare example, and I think also, referencing the Scotland landscape depictions of the 1910s that you see in this early landscape. The pervasive blue and greens in this, and you have to remember when Gladys started taking up art in all earnest from 1957 onwards, she had to rely on a memory, on what she remembered about her life, her upbringing, her childhood in the Eastern Cape, and that is what gave rise to a lovely example such as this one. And you have to remember that she was a self-taught artist, and that probably explains for the, if you like, naive rendering of the traditional huts there. Another type of still life, landscape by Maggie Laubser in this particular example. And a very characteristic feature of Gladys Mgudlandlu's work is her depiction of the township in Nyanga and Mgudlandlu, where she also lived her whole life when she moved to the Cape. And this work is interesting because of the interesting facades of these shacks. She also calls them pondokis, because they almost take on the features of an angry face. Maybe the inhabitants of these shacks angry about their living conditions. And this was also, you have to remember, the forced removals, the time of the beginning of the forced removals, segregation, separate areas for separate race groups and the like. And it is a theme that she carries on throughout her life. A lovely bird's eye view of Cape Town with Table Mountain in the back. And it is perhaps the most impressionistic that you would find in the work of Gladys. You know, it's almost like a Monet landscape with that Japanese woodblock inspired bird's eye view that the French Impressionists are so famous for. But the townships almost nestling within a rural area that you can see beautifully depicted in this example. Another lovely example that is on the exhibition. And when you compare that to the built structures of Maggie, you have an example such as this. You know, it's not your rural hut. It is more a permanent dwelling, a more square dwelling. Now, apart from the birds and the landscapes, also what is parallel in their art is their depiction of portraits, as you can see in these two lovely examples. On the left, portrait by Gladys Mgudlandlu. On the right, Maggie Laubser. It's interesting that Maggie painted a number of self-portraits, as you can see on the right. Gladys never a self-portrait. The only portrait of her I could find was one painted by George Pemba. She's holding that particular portrait, and I promise you I searched high and low for it, and nobody in South Africa can tell me where on earth that particular portrait of Gladys is that was painted by George Pemba. Maggie, when she was in Germany, was fond of depicting the bohemian sector of society, and also some of the sex workers. An example that you see on the left there. Back in South Africa, the more typical portraits of the working class, as you can see in these two lovely examples here. And moving towards figure studies, I think these are two phenomenal examples by Gladys Mgudlandlu, where she's almost like she's squashing the figure, foregrounding the figure to give us a sense of what that person was. I particularly like the work on the right, a pipe-smoking Xhosa woman. The two figures here, the manner in which she composes her figure studies, and again that idea of rhythm that is so strong in the work of Gladys Mgudlandlu, you can see clearly in evidence in this wonderful example. A more static figure by Maggie Laubser in this one. One of my favorite works on the exhibition is this one. It is from the SABC collection. What I always try to do when I curate one of these exhibitions is to approach institutions such as museums and galleries, so that these places can still find a way into the public imagination, and that we don't forget about their wonderful collections. This year was particularly difficult, but I managed to collaborate with MTN. I showed you that example earlier on, and also the phenomenal exhibition of the SABC. Now, again, apart from birds, landscapes, portraits, you also have flower studies, and you can see an example of that. And I think here, their parallel lives, I think, probably depart. I could only find one example of what one would call a proper still life by Gladys Mgudlandlu. But in the main, she was fond of creating these landscapes of flowers that you can see on the right-hand side. Maggie, very fond of including cats in her still lives. But Gladys, as I say, these fields of flowers, that is what she was famous for. These are also very interesting flower pieces, because in my mind, they reference her interest in mural painting. You'll have to remember that she grew up in the Eastern Cape. She was basically raised by her grandmother. Her grandmother taught her how to paint those traditional murals on the dwellings there, and these things, I think, is how she developed, because I can imagine these becoming murals in a household. But for me, certainly phenomenal examples of her interest and her exploration of flowers. Now, another interesting parallel aspect of these two artists is their interest in rendering the issue of labor in South Africa. Now, Maggie Laubser, I think, tended to suggest a more traditional division of labor between the sexes. The men herding the cattle, the women doing more domestic work, as you can see there. But sometimes they challenge that, as you can see in the example on the right-hand side of the harvest, where the women also, not only the men, are involved in the harvesting. And the harvesting scene, a very important theme that Maggie certainly explored throughout her life, becoming more abstract here. Earlier ones, this is in the Pretoria Art Museum, a famous example of this. And a very early one, this one she did when she was in Belgium as well in the 1910s. But for me, the breakthrough, the absolute breakthrough of the exhibition was this particular work. It is in the Javid Foundation collection at the University of Pretoria. And here Gladys suggests something completely different. She suggests that cattle herding is not only relegated to the domain of the males, it's also the females. And of course, the females had to take on that role because the men became migrant workers at that time. They had to work, leave their homesteads in the rural areas and had to go to the mines to work to there. And of course, the women had to take on the role of the work, the labor of the men. Now, another very interesting aspect of these two artists is the fact that their later work tended to become completely abstract. When you look at the stylistic development of Maggie Laubser, you can make out a strong case that she started off with early, like British Impressionist, an early British Impressionist style. In Germany, she then changed radically to that very expressive, colorful German Expressionist style. But this is what her work like in later life, in the 60s and early 70s. She died in 1973. Here's another example. You can barely recognize them. They are so abstract. But the same happened with the art of Gladys. Her work became increasingly more abstract, as you can see in these examples. Right. In terms of Gladys Mgudlandlu's contemporaries, I think this is quite an eye-opener. This is Valerie Desmore, a contemporary of Gladys. There's always, the belief that Gladys was the first Black woman to have a commercially successful exhibition in Cape Town in 1961. Valerie Desmore was soon to follow. But the interesting thing here is, again, like Gladys had that bird's eye view of the Cape Township. Here you have Valerie depicting somebody lying on the floor, perhaps looking up towards all the faces, maybe an injured person on the floor or in the road, and all these people crowding around him or her, and this person looking upwards and seeing those faces surrounding her. Or the other one, from the back, from the head of the top, looking towards the prostrate body that work on the right-hand side. This is an example of Anna Mashinini, also a contemporary of Gladys, and interesting, again, look at that figure in the middle there, almost encased, boxed in what could be a shack, but also what could be sort of a little garden or township. I find that quite interesting. Now, I mentioned the aspect that, as you can see up to now, their lives really ran in parallel with each other in terms of their lives, in terms of their art, in terms of their experiences. But when you come to the visionary part, I think for me what is important is that there are different facets of the visionary nature of their art. Visionary art can be, I think you can put that on a continuum. On the one hand, basically somebody with a lot of foresight, predicting the future, having a vision of what the future holds, and the like. And on the other end of the continuum, you have somebody who is very imaginative, who sees things, who's more speculative, more fanciful. And I think Maggie might belong to that part. But the visionary nature I see in this particular example, and I mentioned the idea of the shadow earlier on. And here you have Gladys depicting three men. But for me, the interesting part is the shadows, because they are not, when you look at the shadows on the foreground, they are not the shadows of these three men. They are, in fact, the shadows of the ancestors. And for me, that I think is a phenomenal aspect of of Gladys's work. Gladys was also called Noma Fanekiso. Noma Fanekiso means the shadow or the picture of a person, and she was given that at her birth because she was such a tiny baby. She was the shadow, people thought, of a human being. She was a picture of not a real person. And jokingly, she much later on said a very apt nickname because I became a painter of pictures. I think the other interesting thing about the visionary nature of Gladys's work is the fact that Bessie Head, in that early review of Gladys's work, pointed out to the political nature, to the political power that art can actually have in society. Bessie was criticizing Gladys because she didn't participate in sort of like a socially aware, politically aware type of art. That came much later in the 1970s with protest art. But Bessie Head, I think, was politically more sophisticated. And you will remember 1963 when that happened. That was soon after the Sharpeville massacre of 1961. And I think Bessie wanted to see artists getting involved in the struggle as well, something that became much more predominant in the 1970s. And here I think it's also, I mean, it's a visionary work where Gladys is wagging the finger at one of her patrons at one of her exhibitions in Cape Town. It was also interesting that this exhibition was mounted in the offices of the oppositional party, not the Nationalist Party at the time. It was the Progressive Party, and the police also swooped in there to investigate what on earth was going on here. Remember, it was the time of segregation. Blacks were not supposed to attend these art exhibitions, but I think Gladys was quite defiant in this regard. Now, I'm moving towards the end of my presentation, and I just want to reflect on the legacy, the phenomenal legacy of these two artists. Maggie Laubser, on the one hand, enjoyed one of the first monographs on her work, like what you see here by Johann van Rensburg, 1974, the year after her death. Hers is also the only body of work collected in the only catalogue raisonné of a South African artist by Dalian Marais, published in 1996. As you can see here, it is a standard reference work. This is her art also formed the basis of many academic studies. I checked with my colleagues at the University of Pretoria, and at Pretoria University, there are no fewer than 6 master's and doctoral studies submitted on the work of Maggie Laubser. I think the extant work is also collected in such collections as the Sandham collection that you can see here. They have no fewer than 88 of her works, and 19 of those works are also painted on the reverse, which brings the total of images to 107. They also have 4 sketchbooks of Maggie, and on average, each sketchbook consists of about 200 pages. So quite a strong holding that they have, and so does the University of Stellenbosch. She bequeathed all her last paintings to them. This is quite a big study conducted by Miller Ballot and his students. This is a book that was published fairly recently, but again, listing all the important work. When we look at the legacy of Gladys Mgudlandlu, I think this is an important publication from 1996. compiled by Elsa Miles. You have to remember this was the dawn of a new political dispensation after 1994, and Elsa collected here the life stories of early black artists. She was attached to the Johannesburg Art Gallery when she did this research, and she reproduced that famous painting of Gladys on the cover of this particular book. Now, in my mind, it seems as though Maggie Laubser's work inspired a lot of academic study, as we've seen. And on the other hand, the work of Gladys Mgudlandlu, I think, inspired a lot of creative work, such as you can see in this particular example. Now, you might wonder what you're looking at. It is an installation of Malcolm Payne at the 1995 edition of the Venice Biennale in the Gardini, and he built these memorial walls with plaques. They resemble what you see in a graveyard with people slotting in the ashes of the beloved one. And lo and behold, I was very interested to see that Gladys also featured in his wall of remembrance. Top right-hand side, you can see there's her little box. Top left-hand side, of course, that's a box for him. He's still alive. And he also includes John Wool there. And an interesting era there, 1795 to 1803. That was the British occupation of the Cape, that period. And 1803 was the end of what is known as the English Revolution. So it was interesting that other contemporary artists, other South African contemporary art, actually wanted a space for Gladys in their creative work, as you can see in this particular example. The next, we have Elsa Miles curating a retrospective exhibition at the Johannesburg Art Gallery and publishing this monograph in 2002. And in 2012, you have restaging of one exhibition of the first exhibition of Gladys in 1961 in Cape Town at the Johannesburg Art Gallery by Nonto Ntobela. You have the cover of the invitation there, and she calls that exhibition a fragile archive, looking at what is known about Gladys, looking at what is written about her, and then trying to plug the holes, trying to give us a sense of the importance of the work of Gladys Mgudlandlu. Another contemporary South African art that draws extensively in his creative work on Gladys Mgudlandlu's work is Kemangwa Leurere. He is, of course, as you know, the recipient of the 2015 Standard Bank Young Artist Award, and he created a specific body of work specially for that award. I'm showing you two examples of handwritten notes done by Gladys in Gladys's own hand, where she relates her own life story. You have to remember that Gladys, apart from being a painter, was also a nurse in a lifetime, also a teacher, an art teacher, and she taught in the Cape Town townships for many, many years. And there are many stories of the manner, the creative way in which she went about imparting the love of art among her learners. What Kemang did was he was inspired by Gladys' work, and then he would do a performance piece by drawing in white chalk on a blackboard as to where the Maggie work led his creative expression. And it, of course, reminds me very much of the work of the Swiss artist Joseph Beuys, who was a conceptual artist, and in the late 1960s, he used the blackboard extensively in his conceptual work. His most famous, probably called How to Teach Art History to a Dead Rabbit. And Kemang was, of course, joined by his aunt, Sophie, in this endeavor. And here you see another example Maggie work on the left and Kemang's chalk drawing on the right. And I think another part of that exhibition was this. Kemang heard from his parents that Gladys painted the walls of her shack in Guguleto. This is where she lived for her whole life. And you also have to remember that Gladys grew up in the Eastern Cape, that she was taught, that she was raised by her grandmother, and her grandmother also taught her the intricacies of painting the murals on the Eastern Cape dwellings and homestead. And she would, of course, paint her house as well in Guguletu. So Kemangwa Leorere teamed up with Bettina Elton, and Bettina did these excavations, so to speak, where she peeled off these layers of paint, and she discovered these phenomenal paintings of birds underneath all those thick layers of paint. And so the point I want to make with this whole thing is that it seems as though Maggie Laubser's art gave rise to a lot of academic studies, as we've seen, but the work of Gladys Mgudlandlu then inspired a lot of contemporary South African artists in their creative practice.